Diabetes Connections is brought to you by the only rapid-acting inhaled insulin, by Dexcom, keeping you in control with an integrated system for diabetes management, and by ViviCap, confidence on the go that keeps your insulin protected in hot or cold.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
This week, FDA approval for Tidepool Loop, an app designed to automate insulin dosing. Born out of the do-it-yourself, we are not waiting movement, Loop has designs and features not in the first wave of approved automated systems like Omnipod 5 and Tandem's Control IQ. CEO Howard Look has a daughter with type 1.
At the end of the day, I think what Katie wanted, and from what I hear from other people living with type 1, is it's actually just all about reducing the burden of managing the disease. And the thing that is most valuable to people isn't the features or the functionality or the time and range. It's let me get back to living my life as normally as I possibly can.
I talked to Howard Look about how Loop does that, and we will go through the features and functionality. If you followed this story closely, you're going to be surprised to learn about a few changes that have happened along the road to approval, and to learn some of the questions Tidepool will have to answer next. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of the show. I'm always so glad to have you here. I am your host, Stacey Sims. My son lives with type 1. My husband lives with type 2. I don't have diabetes, but I have a background in broadcasting, and that is how you get the podcast. And as a broadcast journalist, that's what I did for my whole career, I got to tell you, I find stories like this to be absolutely fascinating, and what a privilege it's been to be following this story from nearly the very beginning. If you're familiar with the We Are Not Waiting movement, you know it very much predates this show, the podcast started in 2015. But I've been able to follow a lot of the prominent players and leaders in that movement to see where they made a huge difference for hundreds, if not thousands, who used the technology before it was commercially available, and then to watch a lot of these folks work for the commercial companies. And along the way, Tidepool has been just absolutely fascinating to watch. So I know you're eager to get to the interview, but I have to give you a few quick notes, especially if you are just learning about Tidepool Loop. So real quick, Loop is software. This company does not make a pump or a CGM. It's as though Control IQ was a standalone program, or if Omnipod 5 was sold separately from the pump. So Loop grew out of the DIY community, and it's part of the movement toward interoperability, where you can get the pump you want, use the CGM you want, and then add on the software. We are not there yet. We are still waiting, but we are getting closer and closer. I often say that podcasting is not the best venue for breaking news. And by now, many of you may know some significant updates about Tidepool Loop that we're going to address here. I do think the interview gives you a lot more context and information, but in a nutshell, Tidepool Loop will not partner with Insulet, the makers of Omnipod, or Medtronic, the two partners who had supported them to this point in the process. My guest, Tidepool CEO and founder Howard Look, will explain much more of this. I first spoke to Howard in 2016, all about the company of Tidepool. He came back on when they announced Tidepool would shepherd Loop through to the FDA. That was in 2018. And then he came on again in early 2021 after the FDA submission. I will link all of these episodes up in the show notes here if you want to hear the evolution of this. I personally find that very interesting. I do like to go back and look at how these companies have started. You know, we've been talking about closed loop systems for years and years, but a common thread here is the openness of Howard and in turn of Tidepool. There is a lot more, a ton more information on their website, which I will link up as well. They have documents and disclosures. They have a whole section that could keep you busy for weeks. It includes the FDA submission. Howard will talk a lot more about that, and that is in just a moment. But first, Diabetes Connections is supported by Afrezza. And since starting this podcast, one of the highest interest topics has been Afrezza inhalable insulin. I love partnering with them to tell you more. Afrezza is an ultra-rapid-acting mealtime insulin. You breathe it in using an oral inhaler. Once inhaled, Afrezza passes quickly through your lungs and enters your bloodstream in less than a minute and may start reducing blood sugars within about 12 minutes. Find out more, see if Afrezza is right for you. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Afrezza logo. Afrezza can cause serious side effects, including sudden lung problems and low potassium, and it's not for patients with chronic lung disease such as asthma or COPD or for patients allergic to insulin. Tell your doctor if you ever smoked, have ever had kidney or liver problems, a history of lung cancer, or if you're pregnant or breastfeeding. Most common side effects are low blood sugar, cough, and sore throat. Severe low blood sugar can be fatal. Do not replace long-acting insulin with Afrezza. Afrezza is not for use to treat diabetic ketoacidosis. Please see full prescribing information, including boxed warning, medication guide, and instructions for use on afrezza.com/safety. Tidepool's Howard Look, thank you so much for joining me. It's great to see you, and congratulations.
Oh, thank you so much, Stacey. It's so great to see you too. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, you got it. I'm so excited to talk to you. I don't know if you remember, but the day in 2018, I believe, when you announced that Tidepool would be shepherding this through the FDA, I was able to jump on and interview you that day. We were together out in California at a conference.
100% remember that. Yeah, we were at Amy Tendrich's conference, and we were in the lobby of a building at the UCSF Medical Center. Yeah, absolutely.
A lot to talk about between then and now.
Yes.
What I'd like to do here is talk nuts and bolts to start with, and then kind of at the end, talk more about really the ideas and a lot of philosophy behind what had happened here. This is pretty monumental in my opinion. So what did the FDA approve?
Well, on Monday evening, we learned that the FDA had approved our 510K submission for Tidepool Loop. 510K submission is a way that a company or what the FDA calls a sponsor says, hey, we have a device and we would like you to review it for safety, for efficacy, for cybersecurity, for usability, for clinical effectiveness, and make sure that it meets what the FDA calls substantial equivalence, meaning does it do everything and work the way the previous predicate device worked? In our case, the predicate device was Tandem's Control-IQ system. And so they were the predicate device for our submission. So we had to show line by line, basically, here is the intended use for the Control-IQ. Here's the intended use for Tidepool Loop. Here is the clinical effectiveness of Loop. Here's how that compares the clinical effectiveness for Control-IQ. And so we did that with our 510K submission, which we sent to the FDA back in December of 2020. And fast forward to January 23rd, Monday of 2023, the FDA said, yes, Tidepool, we agree with you that Tidepool Loop is substantially equivalent, and we are now clearing you. We are issuing you a clearance letter, which means you may now market and tell the world about your product. So that's what we learned on Monday.
Got it. We have done many episodes with you explaining a lot about what Tidepool Loop is. I don't want to rehash everything here, but what does happen next? Obviously, I can't go to the App Store and grab this today, but
not quite yet.
But when it's released, what happens? How do people access it? How does it work in a practical sense?
Yeah, in a very practical sense, what we have done is we've taken what was known as Loop, or we call it DIY or do-it-yourself Loop. So we started with that source code, made a bunch of improvements to it, ran it through our regulatory quality system and all of the processes that go along with that. And we have now created a built version of Tidepool Loop. And eventually users will be able, people living with diabetes will be able to go to the App Store. And just like with any other app, you'll be able to just download Tidepool Loop. It will require a prescription, and people will get a prescription from their healthcare provider. The healthcare provider will log into Tidepool's prescription portal and, working with the person living with diabetes, come up with the initial set of settings, things that we're all used to, like carb ratio and insulin sensitivity factor, target range, and so on. And that prescription will then also come with an activation code. So the user, either via email or text message, will get an activation code. And after they download the app from the App Store and then enter their activation code and verify who they are, they'll be able to use Tidepool Loop. Well, let me stop there and see if you have any questions.
I have lots of questions. Of course, I have questions.
Yeah.
I have some specific questions about that. But my first question is there, and pardon my ignorance, are there other medical apps in the App Store that require prescription like that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a pretty rapidly growing field. I can think of a few examples. There's a company called Pear Therapeutics, for example, that makes prescription applications for addiction treatment, for insomnia, for example. There are a few prescription apps in the diabetes space. WellDoc is well known for creating an app in the diabetes space that requires a prescription. So digital therapeutics, as they're known, or DTX, that's a pretty rapidly evolving field where there's a whole new wave of digital health applications that aren't just general health and wellness applications. They're actually software that you need a prescription for.
That's really cool. You get your code, you put it in, and as you said, basal rates, carb ratios, all the pump settings are already preloaded by your doctor.
That's exactly right. We, in working with the FDA, felt it was important that at least the initial set of settings is something that you collaborate with your healthcare provider on. And so the healthcare provider goes to our prescription portal, will provide some general guidelines. We start with the ADA guidelines based on total daily dose and weight and things like that. And then the healthcare provider will be able to come up with the initial set of settings and issue the prescription to the person living with diabetes.
Many people use DIY technology because of the flexibility. When we last talked, it was it was after submission, but a while ago. You couldn't really talk too much about the parameters that were going to happen here. Can you speak to that at all now in terms of how much flexibility people will have with target ranges and things like that?
I absolutely can. Now that we are an officially FDA cleared device, I can actually say what was cleared. And I can tell you that the FDA did accept our verification and validation data and clinical evidence that would allow Tidepool Loop to have a flexible target range that can be set as low as 87 milligrams per deciliter and as high as 180 milligrams per deciliter. So we're pretty excited about this. A lot of the existing systems have far more tightly constrained parameters. So what this is going to do is allow people living with diabetes and their healthcare providers to come up with the settings that are best for them, given their current life situation.
I have so many questions. Okay, the first one is, when the doctor writes that prescription, can the doctor dictate what that low or high range is set to? Or once the person gets it in their hands, they can adjust it?
Both. As part of the prescription process, the doctor enters the initial set of settings. Those become part of the bundle of settings that get delivered to Tidepool Loop when the app is authorized using that prescription code. So the doctor creates the initial settings, but then the user, the person living with diabetes, can review the settings and say, yep, still looks great, and I'm going to go with what my doctor suggested, or they can go in and make changes. As we all know, diabetes is a self-managed disease. People change their settings all the time on current insulin pumps, both open loop and closed loop systems. And we felt that it was really important to empower the person living with diabetes to make those changes on their own after they receive that initial set of settings from their healthcare provider.
Why 87?
Well, that is the number after we did the analysis of the data, that there was a pretty obvious, clear point where 87 struck the balance between flexibility, but also safety. So I think over time, we may see changes to that. But based on the clinical data that we analyzed, along with our partners at the Jape Center for Health Research, 87 seemed like the right place to draw that line for now.
Well, I could get in the weeds, and I will try not to dwell too much on too many details because I know people have lots and lots of questions. With the time that we have, talk a little bit, if you could, about the system itself, because this is not a system that comes in a box. As you said, you get the app, but there are other components, the actual hardware. As I read the release, it is going to work with Dexcom. Can you talk about pump companies? When we last spoke, there were agreements in place. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself there, but what pumps will this work with?
Yeah, it's a great question. So yes, indeed, Dexcom continues to be a wonderful partner for us, and they continue to be a development partner for Tidepool Loop. And the data that we submitted was all based on using the Dexcom G6 as a CGM, and specifically as an iCGM, which is an integrated continuous glucose monitor, which is part of this interoperable system. As far as our pump partners go, it's a really wonderful question. If you remember back to 2018, 2019, we announced that both Insulet and Medtronic were development partners for us with Tidepool and Tidepool Loop. And we're super incredibly grateful to them because both Insulet and Medtronic did help fund the development of Tidepool Loop. Those two companies have since decided from a commercial standpoint, providing compatible devices for Tidepool Loop is not part of their plans. We actually have published a blog post that goes into the details as provided from those companies. So unfortunately, at this point, neither Medtronic nor Insulet will be providing pumps that are compatible with Tidepool Loop. We do have other pump partners that we're working with. Unfortunately, we can't say who they are at this point. They're not quite ready to talk about their involvement. But what I can tell you is what we got cleared, what we worked through with the FDA, is we don't have to do another submission. So when there is a compatible ACE pump, and ACE stands for alternate controller enabled insulin infusion pump, when there is a compatible ACE pump that has demonstrated to the FDA through their submission that they are eligible to be controlled by a third-party controller like Tidepool Loop, we can make that ACE pump work with Tidepool Loop and put the update in the App Store without an additional submission through the FDA. Because what we did with the FDA is we came up with very specific plans and procedures. They're called SOPs, standard operating procedures, which are basically just big checklists of all the things we need to do to demonstrate that the device can work safely and securely and effectively with Tidepool Loop.
I'm not trying to do a gotcha here, Howard, by any stretch of the imagination, but I have to ask, there's only one ACE pump that I know of approved in the United States, and that's the Tandem t:slim X2. I know you cannot speak to the pump companies. Are there other ACE pumps that I am missing in the United States?
Insulet, actually, also the Omnipod Dash and the Omnipod 5 have both been cleared.
Oh, I'm
as
sorry. I
ACE
meant
pumps.
that you hadn't. I meant that you had still potential partners
sorry.
with. I meant of your remaining dance partners.
There are other insulin pump developers. And again, unfortunately, I can't tell you who they are that are working on third-party enabled ACE pumps. And they haven't yet announced their intention to do that. But once they do, we'll be able to talk to you about it.
Yeah. I can hear my listeners in my ear wanting me to ask this. And again, I know you cannot answer all of this and you may not just want to, but I got to say, I think there are a lot of people who went, what? When they heard that insulin was not going to partner with you because they had been there pretty much from the beginning. And most people, if not all the people who use DIY Loop, use an Insulet product. Can I ask, any reaction to that? I assume you're disappointed.
Obviously, I would love it if Insulet provided an insulin pump that were eligible for third-party control and that they would continue to be a partner for Tidepool Loop. I think they have a great product in Omnipod 5. I can understand the decision that they made. At this point, I think my best bet would be to refer you to Insulet and also to the statement that they gave us, which you can read on our website.
You got it. And we will, of course, link up all of that so you can read the blog posts as well.
Super.
Speaking about those trials, though, when we last talked, you had mentioned that this was, I would call it, these are not your words, I would call it a non-traditional clinical trial or submission in that you didn't do a new one. You didn't put the device, there's no device, you didn't put it on people and have them wear it and show it. You used all the data that was from real world people using the DIY Loop system, right? Can you share a little bit about that?
That's exactly right. And I think that's one of the amazing things about this journey and about the story of Tidepool Loop. And this was actually at the suggestion of the FDA. The FDA has made a really big push towards the utilization of what they call real world evidence, RWE. And back when it became very clear that the DIY Loop system had become very popular, the agency encouraged us to use that real world evidence from the DIY loopers. So we iterated both with our partners at the Jape Center for Health Research and with the FDA on what that protocol would look like. But at the end of the day, it was an observational study as opposed to an interventional study, an observational study of people using the do-it-yourself loop system. What's incredible about it is over 1,000 people were enrolled in the study. Over 850 people in the study contributed between 6 and 12 months worth of data. It's an enormous study. The amount of data in the Loop observational study of DIY Loop if you total it all up and think of it in terms of person days looked at in the study, it's 3 times the amount of data compared to, at the time, the pivotal studies for Control-IQ, Basal-IQ, and the Medtronic 670G combined.
Wow.
So it was really an incredible amount of data. And what that allowed us to do was whenever the FDA would ask a question, they would say, well, can you show us what this looks like in your pediatric patients where the data is constrained to the set points that you've proposed for Tidepool Loop? We had so much data that we could go back to our friends at the Jabe Center and say, hey, can you recut the data, reslice the data in this way so that we can demonstrate to the agency that this algorithm is safe and effective when used in this way? To me, it's really an incredible testament to the power of the community. I mean, people just stepped up. People in the community said, absolutely, I'm going to do all the work. Like, being in a study is a lot of work. You have to fill out a ton of surveys. You have to take at-home HbA1c tests. You have to respond to phone calls. You have to report all of your adverse events. Like, there's a lot of work that goes into being in the study. And over 1,000 people did that from the DIY community. And we're just so grateful to the effort that they put in that made this possible.
Yeah, that's huge. I had asked you about the settings for the range of Tidepool Loop.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to the system itself in terms of people who have used things like Control-IQ or Loop or Omnipod 5 are kind of getting used to how these automated systems work by adjusting basal or giving a bolus once an hour? Any detail that you can share with us on how it works? Right back to Howard answering my question. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dexcom. And we have been using the Dexcom system since my son Benny was 9. We started back in December of 2013, and the system just keeps getting better. The Dexcom G6 is FDA permitted for no finger sticks for calibration and diabetes treatment decisions. You can share with up to 10 people from your smart device. The G6 has 10-day sensor wear, and the application is so easy. I haven't done one insertion since we got it. Benny does them all himself, which, if you have a kid with diabetes, you know is a huge deal. Benny's super busy, and he knows he can just take a glance quickly at his numbers to make better treatment decisions. Of course, we still love the alerts and alarms, and that we can set them how we want. If your glucose alerts and readings from the G6 do not match symptoms or expectations, use a blood glucose meter to make diabetes treatment decisions. To learn more, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. Now back to Howard Look talking about how Tidepool Loop works.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge white paper on our website that actually goes into all kinds of nerdy, gory detail on how the underlying algorithm works. What I'll tell you is, just from a person living with diabetes, if you're used to all of the traditional pump settings like basal rates, like insulin sensitivity factor, carb ratio, those are all still there. And so you work with your healthcare provider, figure out what the right settings are for you. There is one additional setting with Tidepool Loop known as a glucose safety limit. And that's basically the lower bound where you're saying to Loop, whatever you do as you're thinking about delivering me insulin, use this as a lower safety limit. So don't let my blood glucose go below that point. And that's the one additional setting that Tidepool Loop introduces. And we have lots of information that teach people and healthcare providers on how to work with that. In terms of using Loop on a day-to-day basis, this is one of the things that we hear that people really love about DIY Loop, which is the user experience. So you still give meal boluses. You can say, I'm ready to eat now. But with Tidepool Loop, like with DIY Loop, what you say is, here are the carbs that I'm ingesting. So I'm, say, having a sandwich and I think it's 30 grams of carbs. But you also get to say, here's the food emoji that I think most closely represents the carb absorption of the food I'm eating. And the 3 default emojis are lollipop, taco, and pizza. And if you've lived with diabetes for a while, you know that that's a good indication of rapid acting carbs, like the lollipop, or average acting carbs, like the taco, or very slow absorbing carbs due to the fat and protein, like the pizza. And so we think that's a really cool way of telling the system what you're eating. The other thing that is unique and nice about Loop is you can actually edit that after the fact. And we've heard from users of DIY Loop that this is great, for example, for parents of kids living with type 1. Sometimes you make your best guess, you put a sandwich in front of your kid, and then your kid decides to only eat half the sandwich. You can actually go in after the fact and edit the carb entry and say, turns out my kid only ate half of that sandwich. Instead of 30 grams of carbs, it's 15 grams of carbs. And Loop will then adapt. And then the final thing that we hear a lot from do-it-yourself loopers that they really like is the ability to use an Apple Watch to control your diabetes from your wrist. So the core 4 features of Loop, which are giving yourself a meal bolus, telling it pre-meal mode, seeing your blood sugar, you can do all of those core features directly from your Apple Watch if you're an Apple Watch user. And I think people really, really like to be able to manage their diabetes discreetly from their watch.
To be clear, many people are extremely familiar with what you just talked about, but I think we're going to a lot of new listeners on this episode as well. When you say the system can adapt to fewer carbs, that 30 example, child is dosed for 30 carbs, only eats 15, you're not magically removing that meal bolus, correct? They're adjusting the basal going forward. The system is adjusting the basal.
That's exactly right. So it does 2 things. One is it for the initial meal bolus, it actually dials back the amount of insulin a little bit and waits to see what happens. The other thing it does is exactly what you described, which it will pull back on the drip, drip, drip of basal insulin and take away insulin that it might have otherwise delivered.
That's one of those things that I think many pediatric endocrinologists understand, but many do not, is that your 3-year-old is not a predictable eater. And I know your daughter was diagnosed a little older, but I can't tell you the amount of times that I was like, what do you mean you're not going to eat that? What do you mean you're not going to eat that?
You have to.
Oh my gosh. But we move on from there. With the smartphone use, with the Apple Watch, we kind of skipped over it. It's implied, again, if people are not familiar with it, it's full functionality from an Apple phone, from an iPhone.
Absolutely. It is not required that you have an Apple Watch, but if you do, you get the additional experience of being able to control Loop from your wrist.
And no change, not yet Android, or yes?
Not yet Android. We absolutely positively intend to port Tidepool Loop to Android. We're not there yet. As you know, the DIY Loop system was written for iPhone, so it was easier for us to start with iPhone as a platform. But we absolutely recognize that in order to reach the broadest population of people living with diabetes, we're going to have to port it to Android as well. And we definitely intend to do that. I can't say when that will be ready at this point.
Speaking of timelines that you probably can't mention, you mentioned the G6. The first question many people ask you is, will this work with the G7? I assume you're going to be having conversations about that if you have not already.
We absolutely are having conversations about the Dexcom G7 with Dexcom. It was just recently cleared in the US, so this is all fresh new information. But one of the great things about the architecture of Tidepool Loop, it is intended to support multiple types of CGMs, whether from the same manufacturer or different manufacturers.
I already mentioned your daughter, Katie. We should say she was diagnosed in 2011.
Hi, Katie. That's right.
I'm guessing she's still in college. She's in her...
She is a senior at Cal and getting ready to graduate. And
awesome.
She is doing great. And we're super proud of her.
And I bring her up. You have 2 other children, but I bring her up because you have used Loop with her. She's been on the system. You've been very public about this for a while. I'm curious, and I can ask you a little bit more about her if you don't mind, but I'm curious if when you look through those mountains of data, you've used the system in your family for quite a while. Did anything surprise you as you looked at the whole community use of it?
Well, I don't know if this was surprising, but it was notable to me that at the end of the day, I think what Katie wanted, and from what I hear from other people living with type 1, is it's actually just all about reducing the burden of managing the disease. And the thing that is most valuable to people isn't the features or the functionality or the time and range. It's let me get back to living my life as normally as I possibly can. And so I think this is true for all automated insulin delivery systems. The less you have to think about your diabetes, the better. The more you can just go about living your normal life, the better. And certainly with Katie, and I've heard this from all my other friends who live with type 1, that's the name of the game. And I think Loop does a very good job of that. And I think other automated systems also do a great job of that.
Yeah, it's very nice to see more and more choices since you and I first talked. I think the first time we talked for the podcast might have been way back 2016. I think I was looking that up. And as you listen, I will link up all of these episodes. It's fun to see the evolution of these companies. I've been doing the show since 2015. But Tidepool didn't start out as this kind of company at all. And it's not still, you do many other things. Can you speak a little bit about Tidepool's mission in terms of data? And I'm going to assume you're going to be continuing down that line.
Yeah, absolutely. Our mission is still the same, which is to make diabetes data more actionable, meaningful, and useful. And we've done that all along through our data management software. And we are still doing that. And as a matter of fact, use of our data management platform has grown dramatically. We saw a huge uptick through the pandemic when it was really important for people to be able to upload their data from home when they couldn't see their endocrinologist in person. And we're seeing an even more dramatic increase now. We started hearing from clinics over the years the kinds of features that they wanted to see in order to support population management and enterprise single sign-on and the ability to do remote patient management. And so we took all that feedback. And last summer in 2022 at the ADA conference, we launched what we're calling Tidepool Plus, which is a suite of functionality built on top of our original data management platform, but that is very specifically giving those clinics and clinic systems the kind of functionality that they've been asking for years and years and years. And that became really, really evident during the pandemic. That was going to be really important to them. So we're thrilled to announce that, we have well over 350,000 accounts within Tidepool now. We've been growing dramatically over the last 6 months. And our new Tidepool Plus functionality has been received really, really well by healthcare providers. We're still giving away the free tier of Tidepool's data management software that we've always had. And in addition, we now have a paid tier called Tidepool Plus. And the great thing about that is we're a not-for-profit, and our goal has always been to be a self-sustaining nonprofit. We'd love to not have to ask people for donations. We'd love to not have to ask the grant-making organizations to keep funding us. And so this Tidepool Plus tier allows us to move towards that goal of being a self-sustaining nonprofit.
This is a delicate question, but I will ask it anyway. You brought up being a nonprofit, and you have asked folks for money, like nonprofits do. You've raised funds.
Sure.
I mentioned, talking to you in 2016, and we've both been around the community for a very long time. And there were so many, I don't want to call them pie in the sky ideas, but lots of high reaching ideas from the DIY community back in the 2011, 12, 13, 14, all that time. A lot of people went into industry and went in some different directions. Some projects have panned out, some have not, some have kind of shifted lanes and adapted. And I know a lot of people, frankly, have been really rooting for Tidepool, but have also been really worried about Tidepool. I guess the question in all that is, I'm sure you have had a lot of nights when you've been up worried as well. Can you take a bigger breath now? I mean, this FDA approval is big as where we sit in the community, not just for the significance, like, wow, this is the first DIY thing that really, look, they got it through. But also, Tidepool is going to catch a break.
I can definitely take a breath, but we're not done yet. There's so much more to do. I will feel really good when we can actually get Tidepool Loop into the App Store and can announce our other device partners. It'll feel really good when we see Tidepool Plus deployed even more broadly than it is now. So we're not out of the woods yet. I would love to move to Europe. I would love to make sure, and the rest of the world, and make sure that our software can find the broadest possible audience. And I'd love to do a lot more work to make sure that people who typically don't have access to devices and systems, both in the US and internationally, can get access to the best possible care. I won't feel like our work is done until every single person living with diabetes has access to the best possible devices and technology to help them live the least burdensome and safest and healthiest life they can.
You mentioned outside of the United States, that's a goal, but you're not really ready to talk about any kind of timeline there or any other partners internationally?
We are not yet officially supported outside of the US. We do know that our data management platform is used outside of the US. We're very popular in certain parts of Europe and in Israel, For example, we don't claim that we meet local data privacy laws, although we are GDPR compliant and we do meet US HIPAA laws. So it is a secure and private and safe system, but every country's got its own quirky data privacy laws, and we haven't gone country to country yet to make sure that we comply with them all. So nothing formal or official to announce, either with the data management platform or with Tidepool Loop when it comes to international use. I will just tell you that we're a tiny little team and we're paddling as fast as we can to get all of the great work we do out there. And it's really important to us that everything we do gets used by as many people as possible.
Tidepool's also unique in how open it is about everything. If you haven't, as you listen, if you haven't gone to the website, if you haven't looked through the documentation, you may be really surprised what they make public. And I asked you this right after you submitted. I'll ask it again. Are you happy that you went down that road?
I'm really happy that we went down that road. It's a really, for me, a wonderful way to build products and to run a company. I like being a not-for-profit. I like being open source. I like being radically transparent about everything we do, because at the end of the day, what it means is that all of the decisions we can make asking ourselves the question, what is the best thing for the diabetes community? Now, do I want to make sure we get to becoming a financially self-sustainable nonprofit? Absolutely, positively. And I think we're well on our way to that with the launch of Tidepool Plus and now with the clearance of Tidepool Loop. But making everything we do available openly, that's part of our mission. And it brings me such joy. I hear several times per year from a new medtech startup that says, hey, thank you very much. We adopted your quality management system and it became the source of our products. And it makes me so happy when I hear about companies like Stenopool in Europe that use our software to deliver healthcare within their country. And there are hospitals in Germany and Brazil that use our open source code to deliver better care. So to me, that's just part of being good members of the diabetes community, and being radically transparent helps us share all the learnings we've had with the rest of the community and hopefully do the best good that we can do.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about pricing. How does this get paid for? Do I go in the App Store and Apple charges me? Does my healthcare insurance come into play? How does that work?
So we haven't yet publicly talked about what pricing will look like for Tidepool Loop. That's something we're going to work out with the device maker partners that we launch with. It's possible that there may be some cost to the consumer. We hope that'll be minimal. It's possible that it will be subsidized by the device maker partners. And it's also possible that over time we'll be able to get reimbursement through health insurance policies. That's going to take years to play out, but we're working through all of those things. Because again, what we really want is for the broadest possible population to have access to our technology.
And then my last question really is, Howard, we mentioned your daughter being diagnosed with diabetes in 2011. If you think back to that time, did you ever think something like this would be what you did? I mean, our children are diagnosed and we get pulled in a direction that suits our talent, I guess. But I never thought I'd be doing a podcast when Benny was diagnosed at age 2. I mean, did this kind of go through your head? Like, I'll use what I know?
Well, I think every parent just wants the best for their kid. And every parent, when your kid is diagnosed with something crazy like type 1 diabetes, asks themselves the question, what can I do? Is there anything that I can do? I just happen to have the skill set of running organizations that build software. I knew nothing about healthcare and knew nothing about medical devices. Frankly, I didn't even know there are different kinds of diabetes when Katie was diagnosed. And so that was all learning for me. And I'm sure you experienced this as well. We get drawn to the area where we think we can make the biggest difference and help our kid. And, at the end of the day, I'm thrilled that what we've ended up building is helpful to people like Benny and Katie who live with type 1 diabetes, and lots of other people will, eventually over time expand into other broadening of what we do into, for example, type 2 diabetes. And I think that that's a great thing. And I'm very proud of the team that I work with and very happy that we've been able to use our talents to do a little good in the world.
Well, Howard, I really appreciate you jumping on with me so quickly, just really a couple of days after the approval. And thanks for sharing so much information. I'm sure we'll have many more questions, so we'll circle back in the weeks to come.
It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Stacey. Thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
This is the part of the show where I say to learn more, go here. I always have an episode homepage with lots of links. I would urge you, of course, to go there. I do have those older episodes with Howard linked up as well. But Tidepool is so open, as I said, that there is so much information about this. If you go to their website, it really is incredible to see all of the documentation. It's one of their hallmarks, and it has served them very well. It has served the community very well, and I'm sure they will continue to do that. I got to tell you, I was pretty surprised when he mentioned that they were not partnering with Omnipod. I talked to Howard for this interview just a couple of days after the approval came through. It may have been public knowledge, but it certainly wasn't on their website or out in wider distribution yet. And that's the case as I'm recording this. So I'll be interested to see what the community response is going to be. Next time I talk to Insulet, I will certainly ask them about this. I am scheduled to talk to Tandem very soon. So, there's a lot to talk about what could come next here. I mentioned at the beginning of the show that I started the podcast in 2015. As many of you know, Benny was diagnosed in 2006. So I've been around the community for a long time. And when your kids get older, you know this, most of you. Benny's 18 now. Your role kind of changes. I don't anticipate my role with the podcast changing very much, but my community role has definitely changed. I want to talk about that in just a moment and what's next. But first, let me tell you about ViviCap. This is such a smart thing. It keeps your insulin at the exact right temperature, even in the extreme heat or cold. It basically goes over your insulin pen. It acts just like a cap. You actually take the regular cap off the pen and slide on the ViviCap. It lasts for years. It fits all pens. It's super easy to use. And, if you live in a place with extreme temperatures, like we do in the summertime around here when Benny was outdoors at camp, it can get over 100 degrees, and you don't want to put your insulin at risk. When he traveled to Israel almost 2 years ago now, 2 years ago, he took one of these with him, and when they were hiking around in the desert, and it was over 100 degrees, and his stuff was in his backpack, probably hotter than that, it protected the insulin, and we had no problems at all. I'm a huge fan of ViviCap. I think this is a great product. I've got a link in the show notes, or you can just go ahead and click through on diabetes-connections.com. You get whatever special they've got going. They've got an extra 20% off right now. And that link also leads you, by the way, to their other products, which includes a Vivi EpiPen Shield. So please check that out. Again, the links are in the show notes, or just click on their logo at diabetes-connections.com. Earlier this month, we had the very first Diabetes Connections Presents Mom's Night Out here in Charlotte. And I got to tell you, I am still just over the moon about how it turned out. This started out as a little dinner I was going to put together, maybe some cocktails, I didn't know, for celebrating my book. When the second book came out, I was going to have a little party here in Charlotte. But the more I planned it and the more I brought in elements from what I liked from conferences that I had been to, it really morphed into a 2-day conference. And I was like, do I really want to do this? How much work is this going to be? And the answer was yes, and a lot more than you ever thought. Was it worth it? 100% yes. I've posted pictures on the Diabetes Connection social channels, so I'm sure you've seen that. If not, I know not all of your moms, certainly not all of your parents, but I have heard from parents all over the country who want me to bring this to them. So I will say I am working on this. And stay tuned. I hope to have some announcements sooner rather than later. And if you are thinking about wanting to do this in your town, I would say don't wait. You don't need me to have a mom's night out. Go ahead and get your girlfriends together, or put it in your local Facebook group and say, we're going out for coffee. We're going for lunch. This is how I started. Back in 2013, I asked 3 moms to go to dinner with me in the North Charlotte area. We posted it on social media, and it picked up and it picked up. And I have a monthly meetup group now that I organize. Sometimes there's 2 of us, sometimes there's 20 of us, but it is always worth it. Do not wait. Please go ahead and do this yourself. It is so much fun. You don't have to do a 2-day conference. I certainly didn't start out like that. Get a couple of people together and go for coffee. It is fabulous. Just like our kids need camp, we need each other. The experience of being a mom of a child with type 1 diabetes is not the same as having diabetes. It's nothing like having diabetes, right? But it is its own unique experience. And it's one that only other people going through it really understand. All right. Thank you to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. Thank you so much for listening. We do have a newscast this Friday. The newscasts are now every other Friday. while the interview episodes stay every Tuesday. Changed up the schedule a little bit for 2023. If you subscribe to Diabetes Connections wherever you are listening on any podcast app, it will be delivered to you, no problem. You don't have to remember when the episodes are. They will just show up on your phone. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here in just a couple of days. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.